Sam, can we not mute people through
Yes, sir.
the session?
Absolutely. It's as a matter of fact, it's actually on. People can unmute themselves now. So yes, sir.
Cool.
Anything you want. Okay, so
hardly anyone voted. Come on, guys. Post the link one more time. Jump on in there and vote, because how you vote matters.
Quiet.
okay, we're live streaming now, and the link is posted on the official xLights page. So, Keith, do you have a splash screen, sir, you can put up?
No.
Okay.
Want to give it a couple more minutes, Brian, before we
Yeah.
start?
Yeah, that's fine. And I just want to make sure it was working, and I'll stop sharing and Keith can share his presentation in just a second.
Recently just kind of been like a little bit of a jealous ball when I walked.
All right, Tony, the floor is yours, then Keith.
Hey, everybody, this is Tony Bigda. Just want to thank the room sponsor, Boscoyo Studios. And we want to welcome Keith to do a xLights overview. Thanks, Keith.
Okay, long introduction. Morning, everyone. It's like stupid o'clock in the morning here. I must admit, this was the most challenging session to do this weekend. The topic is deliberately vague because I really had no idea what sort of audience we were going to get in terms of experience, and it's a real mixed bag. It's looking at the survey responses, about half people are brand new at this, very new, either have never used it at all or used it very little and are very lost. And then the other half have got reasonable experience and kind of know what they're doing and are kind of looking for additional information. And so trying to satisfy the needs of both groups is going to be very, very challenging. So what I thought I'd do, and look, I'm happy to accept feedback on this in the chat. I might spend the first half hour or to an hour of just doing a sort of a quick overview of xLights for those that are in the very new and learning, trying to learn a little bit about it. And then the latter half, what I might do is sort of deep dive into a couple of little things that people are challenged by, or potentially answer some questions that might come up, maybe touch on some of the things that have changed over the past year since last VCS, and spend a bit of time on that sort of stuff and try and satisfy both groups of people. So let's start off. I'll share my screen here. We're using the latest version of xLights. It happens to be 2021.11. Before I start off here, I've been a bit MIA for the last couple of months at least. I've been somewhat preoccupied with a project with Dave Pitts, trying to get his new controller to market and getting his firmware all working. That's been occupying pretty much every waking hour that I have. And so that's meant that I haven't spent as much time on other things and on xLights in the last couple of months. But hopefully we're almost at the end of that, and you'll see all of that tomorrow afternoon when we run through all of that. The other thing is if you're in this group of people that are new to xLights, etc., I assume you found by now the January seminars. I do a January seminar every year. I strongly suggest you look for the 2021 version of that seminar rather than watching the earlier versions. I leave the earlier versions on YouTube mainly because YouTube basically penalizes you. I can't easily go and replace a video with a more up-to-date one and then keep the same level of attraction of new people looking for videos. So the old ones tend to stay up, and I add links to them to try and encourage people to go and watch the newest one. But if you haven't watched the 2021 video, I will caution you, the video session went for almost 6 hours. It was a marathon. And even when cut down for YouTube, it was still it's 4 videos, and it goes for, I think, slightly over 4 hours. So it's a pretty hefty watch, but at the same time, it goes through pretty much everything that you would need to know. It's always a little bit light on the sequencing piece. We tend to spend a lot of time on layout and controllers and getting all of that sort of stuff to work. And the reason we do that is because, to be honest, these days, most people spend the bulk of their time there. Those people that do go and do their own sequences obviously spend a large amount of time sequencing, but the most people don't do a huge amount of sequencing. They'll do a bit here and there, and they'll tweak a few things here and there. But mostly these days, people are either buying or using one of the many free resources available with sequences for their displays, and particularly in their first season. So that's why we have a tendency to focus very heavily on the layout. Now, through the presentation, I am incredibly happy for you to pipe up and ask a question, ask a clarification. I'd much prefer that over you leaving things in chat or the like, where I won't necessarily see them. So please, yeah, do speak up if you've got questions or things that you'd like me to spend more time on. So for those of you, I assume everyone has at least opened xLights up. xLights can be very confusing just because there is so much to it. And that's even more true once you get into the sequencer than it is in the controller and the layout tab. xLights is actually a set of tools. Everyone gets quite focused on xLights itself, and the vast majority of people will just use that. But if you actually go into the xLights folder where xLights is installed, you'll find that there's actually a set of programs associated with xLights. So there's xLights itself, but there's also the show player, xSchedule, which somewhere in the order of 20 to 30% of people use. And then there's a set of utilities. There's an xCapture utility, which was created to allow people to capture data played from other sequences and replay them on things like the Falcon Pi player. So basically provides a way to capture the data that is being played out of something like a Matrix or a Vixen or anything else, so that you can play it back onto a Falcon Pi player. I mean, that's not much point on a Vixen, but on Matrix it can be quite useful. There's xFade, which is an attempt at a more live capability. It's fairly primitive when you compare it to things like Matrix and even Jinx and the like, but it provides some of the xLights capability in a more live set scenario. And then there's xScanner, which was first developed late last year, and it's more of a discovery and configuration analysis tool that helps understand people's show networks. And it was built as a first attempt to try and provide a way to give the guys in the Zoom room, which gets very busy in December and November, a way to analyze the way someone's network has been set up and all their controllers have been set up, so that when they're troubleshooting, things can go a little bit quicker. So if you haven't run that, if you actually run that tool, it actually goes out to your network and scans on your network and will actually look for all of your controllers. It'll look for all your FPP instances. It's reasonably aware. It takes a little bit of time to run. It's actually a lot faster than it used to be, but we'll let that run in the background and we'll come back.
Keith, I don't think you're sharing the screen.
Oh, I lost it, did I?
I believe so. I'm not seeing anything.
Okay, we can do that again.
Thank you.
There you go. So yeah, so the scanning tool, it's off here. It's off pinging my network, looking at all the IP addresses and scanning for all the devices out there. But we'll come back to that one later. So let's go back to xLights. xLights, the three key tabs here are the controller tab, the layout tab, and the sequencer tab. The controller tab is where you define all of your controllers. The layout tab is where you do your show layout, and your sequencer tab is obviously where you start to create your sequences. If you're a new user to xLights, start with the layout tab. You do not need to define a controller until you're at the point where you want to start pushing things out to your lights. So don't start here. Just because you've got your controller, there's no reason to start and define it all there. Spend your time, get your layout right, and when you're happy with your layout, then we go and configure our controller. Now, the other thing is that xLights is heavily based off this show folder. So here I've created a show folder just for this presentation. You can have as many show folders as you like. And so if you're very new to xLights and you just want to play around for the first few times, just create yourself a show folder, put it on your desktop, put it somewhere temporary, play around in xLights, and when you're ready to actually start on your show proper, go up and create yourself a new show folder, which will be your proper show folder that you want to use. The only thing that I would strongly recommend is don't in the last folder name in the path, and it doesn't matter what's up here in these earlier folders, but this last show folder, this is your show folder itself. This is where everything is going to be stored for xLights. Don't put the date in this name. If you must put the date, if I really wanted to put a date in this name, you know, I could go in here and create a folder 2021, right? But then I want to go inside that 2021 folder and create another folder, which is my show folder, right? This is okay. Who cares? It's okay to have the date up here, but don't put the date in the last show folder name. And the reason for that is what's eventually going to happen is you're going to want to change this to be 2022 and 2023 and so forth. And if you've put the show folder in this last name here, a lot of the file linkages that xLights will maintain will get broken over time and you'll have problems. So don't do that. Don't put the date in this folder name here. If you must put a date in, put it somewhere further up here in the path name. On the layout, this is where you get to define all of your models. And I strongly suggest you create your models in xLights first before you go and build them, including if you go and you buy your Boscoyo model, you definitely want to create it in xLights, and then you want to follow the wiring pattern that xLights supports on your model. We do get people that go and build their models first and then come into xLights and then they try to model them. Now, there is almost always a way to do that modeling, but that modeling can be more challenging. It can force you to do things in ways that you otherwise would prefer not to do things. And so let me give you an example. Let's take something simple like a matrix. Now, when you build a matrix in xLights, xLights supports a number of different ways. Now, it lets you start the wiring from any of the corners, which sounds fine, right? Except I've seen people build matrices where they've started the wiring in the middle and they've wired it as two halves. That will inherently be harder to build in xLights. Not impossible to build, harder to build and harder to use in your show. xLights then allows you to go up and down, either go up and down or horizontally across, but it kind of assumes that the strings of lights that you use are always the same length. So this is 16 strings of 50. So it's very easy to model this as 4 strings with 4 strands per string and 200 nodes. And if we look at the node layout here, you'll see that this is 4 strings of pixels. So this is string 1 down here and it's zigzagging across horizontally, and then string 2 starts and it zigzags across horizontally, and then string 3 starts and zigzags across horizontally. But you'll notice that in xLights, there's no easy way to have different numbers of nodes per string. So if you had 4 nodes of 200 and then 1 of 150, there is no easy way to model that using the matrix model in xLights. Now, that's going to, again, it doesn't mean that you can't do it in xLights, but it means that you won't be able to use the built-in matrix model. You're going to have to go and use a custom model to create those sort of models. So generally speaking, I would recommend you try to model it in xLights first, because if you can build your model the way it's supported in xLights, you'll find that there are advantages to doing that. There are slight performance advantages in using the inbuilt models. There can also be some advantages in terms of some of the buffers that are supported are slightly different across the models, which change how you can sequence them. And so using the built-in models is generally a better thing to do. Let's quickly run through the models themselves so you get a feeling for them. The arch model is obviously for creating what are typically, arches created out of nodes or strips. There are a set of options here, and we'll go through some of these options shortly, but all the models have a set of options that support a set of variations. So for instance, there are options here that allow you to layer the arches. And so you can create multiple layers of arches. So 2 layers of 50, and so you get a 2-layer arch and so forth. Again, it makes some assumptions about how these things are wired, and multi-layered arches always assume that you wire it from the inside to the outside. So if you look at the node layout here, string 1, which is the middle string, is always assumed to be the first string. So if you started wiring it from the outside in, at the moment at least, this model does not support that. It does allow you to switch from side to side, but it doesn't allow you to start the wiring on the outside of the model. There is also a wiring view here, which you might find easier to use, where you can see. Now this by default is in the reverse view. Learn how to use right-click. There's lots of right-click menus here. But we can look at this from the front, and so you can see the wiring here is starting in the center and then going to the outside and coming back. So you definitely want to take advantage of the wiring view. There's a wiring view here as well if you select this model. And again, it gets a little bit hard to see when there's thousands of nodes here. And if we go to the front view, you can see that it's starting node 1 down here. Very hard to see. Need a bigger screen. So there's your arches model, there's your candy canes model. Now your candy cane model is also useful for modeling sticks. So if you've got just sticks of pixels going up, you can just click the checkbox here and you'll get sticks. And so you can have as many of those as you want. There's 3 there, we could make it 10. Right, lots and lots of sticks. The channel block model. The channel block model is not commonly used, but if you're coming from Lightorama and you're used to sequencing just at the channel level and you'd like a similar way to represent things in xLights, xLights is more than capable of sequencing old AC type lights. So if you don't care to have the model look on the screen like your wireframe or whatever else you're using, and you just want access to the raw channels to sequence, then throwing down a channel block model can be a great way to allocate by default 16 channels. You can come in here and say what color each channel is driving. So if you've got a red set of lights here on port 3, you can come up and just say that's a red set of lights, and xLights will know and will represent that particular channel as a red channel in the sequencer when you're sequencing and things like that. So that's why the channel blocks are there. You can define, I think, up to 64 channels in a single channel block model, but then you can add as many channel block models as you like. Then you have your circle model, and your circle and your wreath model are very similar. In fact, if you draw both of them, they look exactly the same. The difference is how they handle layers and the wiring that occurs. So again, get in there, create multiple layers, and take a look at how those wiring views are created. You can do the same thing here, except you don't get to create layers, you just create multiple strings. This is a wreath, so you don't get to create the layers. So on a single layer, it looks very similar, but beyond that, it doesn't look the same. Again, take a close look at the wiring view, because the wiring is, again, although in this case the options around wiring are a lot more flexible. You can start it in the middle or the outside. You can go clockwise or anti-clockwise. Both things are possible using these various starting locations. The cube model. Pixel cubes don't look great here in 2D. If we go into 3D mode, the cube model starts to actually look like a cube. But we'll stay in 2D mode. The cube model can be really useful, not just for people that are building pixel cubes, which are relatively uncommon. You don't get many people building pixel cubes just because of the number of pixels that it very quickly consumes. But it can also be useful if you've got a yard full of pixel stakes all laid out in a regular grid. The cube model can be a great way to represent that and give you access to some additional render buffers that allow you to do some really cool things that is a lot harder to do if you model those sticks all out as either a candy cane model, or I'll show how you can use the polyline model to do that as well. The custom model is the catch-all, and we'll actually come back to the custom model when we go to the download. The DMX model is used for a whole bunch of different things. There's a general one which allows you to model pretty much any DMX device. It doesn't give you on the screen a great deal of a great representation other than a set of bars showing you the values that the channels are getting. But then there are more specific types like floodlights and moving heads, servos, skulls. The servo model is extremely powerful in terms of representing all sorts of moving devices that you might create, and the skull model is designed for those sort of 3D plastic skulls with multiple servos, etc. The moving head and the moving head 3D model, if you have those sorts of devices, they take a lot of configuration. You've got to set all the channels, etc. But this allows you to control those sorts of things. Definitely not as powerful as dedicated show layout software that's all about setting up a stage, etc. It's not at that level, but if you're building a Christmas show and you just have a couple of moving heads in it, this is more than adequate for sequencing those sorts of things. And then if you have something as simple as a fog machine or something, you can use something like the general model, which just here draws as a box. And you can configure the number of channels and colors and things like that. So this is great for fog machines and bubble machines and that sort of stuff. The image model is not that exciting until you're actually associated with an image, but this can be really useful, particularly if you're coming from an AC show and you just like to represent each prop as a picture of the prop or a picture of something representing the prop. I have a blow-up Santa in my show, and so I represent him as one of these. It's got a string of lights in it which I can control and dim, etc. And so I can turn those on and off. And so this has by default just a single channel associated with it, which allows me to turn it on and off. And so the image model can be useful for those sorts of things. The icicle model, useful when you're putting icicles around your house. It has the ability to shear, so that if you're putting the icicles on the peak of your house and you want them hanging down, you can configure them. You can control the pattern associated with those lights here by defining the drop pattern here. All very flexible. We quickly showed the matrix model. The line model allows you to just draw single straight lines of pixels, fairly commonly used on things like house outlines, etc. Do suggest that you draw things consistently. I typically draw them left to right. I find that I tend to draw them left to right when I'm drawing these, or follow the wiring. The polyline is useful where you've got multiple straight lines in a row. Every time you click, it drops a point. Everyone asks, how do I stop it? You press the escape key to stop it. You can then come in and change this thing. So you do have the ability to click on individual segments like this, and you can define individual segments here, open it up, and I can choose a segment and add extra pixels and control the number of pixels in each segment. So if you're doing a house outline, this is quite a common way to do a house outline. It also allows you to do things like arches. So if you click on a segment, right click on it and do define curve, it gives you these red handles, and you can drag those red handles around and actually curve it. So if you've got an arch on your house, an arch around a window or something, and you'd like to have the pixels follow that, you can definitely use the polyline to lay those pixels out quite effectively. And then you can come and edit that segment down here, and again, add more lights as necessary to that particular segment. The other thing that you can do with the polyline is that you can actually use the polyline as icicles as well, and you do that by changing the drop pattern here. So if I create a 3-4 drop pattern, you get alternating nodes of 3 and 4. If I have 1 pixel between each, you can still put that in. So if you've got a pixel, an icicle layout that looks like this, you can do it that way and define as many as you need to. Now, if you want to do pixel stakes going around your garden, you can also do this by defining a -7, and it turns the drop downs into now go up, and then combined with your curve, you can actually do pixel stakes that follow a curved driveway or something like that quite easily with the polyline model. It's quite flexible from that perspective. I'm going to skip over the globe model. Like the cube model, it's a 3D model if you're building a globe. The spinner model allows you to define a spinner. You can go and define the number of arms, etc. The spinner model, actually, much like the icicle model, and even I'm pretty sure the polyline model, does offer you the ability to do alternate node numbering. We'll go up and do it actually on the candy canes. So there is this checkbox here called alternate nodes. If you look at this wiring view, well, actually, let's not do the wiring view. Let's do the node layout. It's a little bit easier to read. You can see that by default for these particular stakes, it's starting node 1 at the bottom, and it goes up 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way up to 18. And then it comes down again and starts at the next one down here. The problem with this is this is actually challenging to wire, because you're going to run the pixels up. That's easy. But then when you get to the top, you've somehow got to run an extension wire all the way back down to the bottom of the next stake and do the next stake up, which is not a particularly friendly way to have to model these things. But if you use this alternate option, and things like the spinner, and I think the polyline as well support this, and you go in and you do the node layout, you'll find that the node layouts become quite jumbled. And so now we've got node 1 here, just like we did before, but node 2 is now the third node up, and then it jumps again to node 3 and so on up, and then it comes back down again. And so the last node on the stake is now the second bottom node, which makes it a lot easier to jump from here to the next stake without having to add large extensions. And so if you buy a set of pixels that with an appropriate gap, etc., yeah, this just makes life a lot easier. The same is true with something like a spinner. No one wants to have to keep running a wire back to the center or jump a wire from arm to arm on the spinner. And so again, there is a way. Where is it? So yeah, center alternate. So if you do center alternate clockwise and you do the wiring view here, you can see that node 1 starts in the center, then it jumps 1 and goes to 2, then 3, then 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, all the way back to 10. And again, it makes it very easy to build that model. So yeah, definitely check out alternate wiring on the models that support it. The star model, definitely the way to build stars rather than using custom models if you can get away with it. Lots and lots of starting locations. The starting locations supported are on the bottom of the 2 feet, in the crotch of the star and the head of the star, and then you can go clockwise or anti-clockwise. The star also supports multiple layers, so you can have multiple layered stars and so forth represented. You can have different numbers of nodes per layer. It doesn't have to be the same. You would typically have the inner star with less nodes and so forth. Using the star model, again, gives you access to different buffers for sequencing on, which are going to make things more flexible when you get to sequencing. So again, suggest you go that way if you can. The tree model, a very, very popular prop. The tree model, by default, it's this 360-degree tree, but there is a whole bunch of different types. You can have flat trees. If you're building a ribbon tree or something, this is quite popular. The ribbon tree is a slightly different representation at the top, recognizing that all of the strings are exactly the same length. But even in the round, a lot of people don't really need a full 360-degree tree. Depending on the layout of your property, people may not be able to see the back of the tree, or maybe they can't see the full tree. Most of my trees are 270-degree trees. So the back of the tree, which you can see in 3D here, is open. Because no one can really see that when they see my display. They can see a little bit on the sides, so I wanted to fill that in, but there was no point putting a bunch of pixels at the back. And these days, where everyone's using the bullet strips that you punch the pixels into, they largely make the back of the tree invisible at any rate. So there's not a lot of point in filling in the back of the tree, so you can cut it down by reducing the degrees. A lot of people also build their trees up against a wall, and so you might want a 180-degree tree instead, allowing the tree to basically sit back against a wall or something. The tree, much like the matrix model, expects all of the strings of pixels to be the same length, and so if you decide to build this using 3 strings, those 3 strings need to be the same length. Once you go beyond that, it gets a little bit more difficult. The tree, unlike the matrix, to be honest, if you build the matrix in some weird and wonderful way, it is not that hard to build a custom model to represent almost any layout that you want to. Quite frankly, if you wanted to spiral the pixels from the center out as your wiring pattern, you could easily build a custom model that would represent that, and it would largely work just perfectly fine in xLights. The challenge with building a tree in those sort of weird and wonderful ways is that it actually gets quite hard to represent the custom model. Not because you can't. I mean, at the end of the day, the buffer for a tree, if you look at the node layout, is still a rectangle. And building a custom rectangle for the tree is extremely easy to do. But obviously, you want the tree to look like this sort of thing, where it's got some sort of representation that reflects the fact that the pixels are wrapped around. That's incredibly difficult to do in a custom model. If I take this model and export it as a custom model, hang on, we're clicking on the wrong model. If I export this as a custom model, we'll export it as a tree, and then we'll import that model back in. There it is there. You can see it does not look the same. All right, and it never will do. It's always going to be, you're going to lose some quality. You're potentially going to lose some nodes. If I come up and I run check sequence is a tool that scans your entire configuration. It's not just for when you're sequencing, it'll also do your layout. And what it will do is it will do a deep scan of your layout and check to see if there are any problems with your layout. So here's the results, right? And you can see that the tree model that we just imported has got a whole bunch of issues. A whole bunch of nodes are missing from the tree. And that's just because when this tree gets exported, a lot of these nodes here are really almost on top of each other. And the export process has lost some of those nodes. And so now I would need to go back in and manually correct them and fix them. And that's before I then go and start to work out, well, how exactly am I going to do all the numbering to represent the wiring that I've done? So this is the hard way. The easy way is to build the tree the way xLights expects the tree to be built and use equal length strings. The window frame model is great for outlining windows. It's also useful for outlining doors. You do have control here, and you can set 0 to the number of pixels, and now you've got a door outline. You may have a window that is hard up against the top of the house, and therefore you don't want the top. Again, you can model that relatively easily using the window frame model. You could also do this using a polyline or a string model. You know, it's much the same. We did show you the import when we imported that tree. But if you're out there purchasing models from the suppliers, there are a couple of vendors, including the sponsor of this room, who sell models and provide a download. Sorry, I'm in Australia. It takes a little bit longer to download. And so this has basically, there's multiple suppliers in here. There are also some built-in fixture libraries. These are both currently disabled at the moment because they take a while to download. But if you're using weird and wonderful DMX fixtures, you may find them in this library. And this DMX model library is some example models of those servo type models. So I think Gil built a snowman and the like. So if you're going to build some servo models, you may want to access this library and download one of those models and take a look at how Gil's done that. But for our vendors have maintained, and they maintain these, xLights doesn't, but the supplier maintains this repository of models that they sell. This is, you know, it's probably not their full catalogue. It takes a lot of time for them to maintain these things, but they essentially upload these models or put these models onto their website, and xLights then goes and downloads an index to them that they maintain, and it has an image of each model, and you can come in and choose it. There's some quite advanced models. Now, one of the advantages of, you can build these models yourself as well in xLights, and we'll go back to the custom model in a minute. But one of the advantages of downloading the models here from the suppliers is they have typically worked out the best way to wire the prop up to minimize the number of cuts and joins that you might need to do, or the number of null pixels that you might need to leave in the middle of your model. But they've also done things like submodel models. And I always like to download the toy soldier here that James has done. Now, when you're doing this, and I don't know if you caught it, it's a trap for young players. When you do the download, when you first click the download button, absolutely nothing happens. You've got to drag out the box first. And when you drag out the box, that's when the download occurs. So while we're here, let's go and grab some singing faces. Yeah, let's do one of the chroma bulbs. And insert that model as well. All right, so that's how you download models. You can go and search that repository. There is a search feature in there as well, so you can go and find exactly the sort of model that you're looking for. Now, these are actually custom models, and you can see, obviously, we don't represent these as standardized models. And so they take advantage of the custom model. You can create these yourself from scratch, but obviously they've already created them. When you're on a custom model, there is this attribute up here called the model data. And if you click on the ellipsis, it brings up this dialog that lets you actually see the model data and all the model numbers, etc. And what they've done is they've effectively just numbered or put numbers representing all the locations of the nodes. It starts 1 at the bottom and then goes all the way around to 150. You can see the wiring model of these things just by right-clicking and bringing up the wiring view. Now, this is deliberately the reverse. The reason we show these models from the reverse is the wiring view was originally built to help allow people to punch pixels into the props and know where they're going. And the reason we do the reverse is because most of these props are typically Coro props. People punch the pixels in from the back. And so having a representation of the model from the back is a lot easier when you're punching pixels in. If you were looking at it from the front, you know, but you had the model from the back and you're punching pixels, you'd actually be punching them in reverse, and then you end up with issues at the end. So that's why we show it from the reverse. Now, it's actually relatively easy. If you go into the model data, let's say you did punch the pixels in reverse. If you want to flip the model around, it's actually relatively easy to do. If you right-click up on the grid here, there's a whole bunch of tools here for manipulating these pixels and creating gaps and things like that. And one of the things you can do is just horizontally flip the model. So if you've accidentally pushed the pixels in reverse, come in here, horizontally flip the model, and then the model will be fine. It'll be your representation. You can also do weird and wonderful things in here as well, though. So let's imagine between 97 and 98, I don't know, for some reason I've put an extra pixel in, and so I need to create another 98, I don't know, here, let's say, and then I want this to be 99 and 100, and I want to increment the models from there on up. Well, you can do that sort of stuff as well. You can right-click in here, and you can say insert prior. Insert one node prior to that node. That node's now 99. Every other node has increased in number, and now I can insert a 98, and my model is again correct. With no gaps. I can also delete a node. So I can delete 98 here, and now I've got a gap, and so I can just right-click here and click on compress, and it will close that gap. So it realized that there was no 98, and so it took 99 and decremented it by 1 and decremented everything after that, and it ends on 150 again. So there's lots of little tools in here to try and make editing custom models a little bit easier to do. Definitely worth playing if you're building it. There's also a custom model builder. So there is a tool up here called Generate Custom Model. And this is a process that a tool that helps you build a custom model from either a photograph, or it will also allow you to create a video which will play a pattern or run a capture pattern onto your prop, and then you can actually load that video back into xLights. xLights will watch the video and will basically place all of the pixels onto the model for you. I'm not going to run through that right now. There are a number of people who have made videos on using that tool to go and create their model in that way. Now, the other thing that you get when you download a model from a supplier like Boscoyo is that you get some of the underlying definitions as well. So with something like a singing prop, you need to define the face definition to say which pixels should light up when various phonemes are being sung in the sequence. And so that's done in the face definition, which is accessed down here. And here you can see that James has defined the pixels that are going to light up. So when the A sound, which is typically the largest mouth shape, you can see these are the pixels that are going to light up, versus the U, which is the smallest mouth shape. You can see which pixels are lighting up here as well. So downloading a model is really useful because you don't have to go in and manually create these face definitions, which is a bit of a pain to do, to be honest. The other one is the soldier here. It doesn't have a face, it doesn't have a singing face on it, but it does have obviously a number of different elements that should be colored in different colors. And that's done with the states, and he's included the states in the model as well. So you can see on the right-hand side here, the boots, the pants, and so forth. And he's even defined the color that those various elements should be, so that when we come to sequence this model, we don't actually have to go and separately or work out which color to turn on which pixels. You can just use this state that has been defined on the model and just turn all the lights on, and all the pixels will turn on the right color. So again, a very powerful reason why you want to be downloading models from suppliers if you can. So that's the bulk of those pieces. So let me talk a little bit about some of the other common properties in here. Now, let's talk about it from the trees perspective, because this often confuses people when it comes to things like strings, nodes per string, and strands per string. And I want people to understand what these things do. So by default, this here is set as 16 strings, 50 nodes per string, and 1 strands per string. The number of strings should represent, or typically represent, the number of connections from your prop to your controller. So this at the moment is assuming that I am got a controller with 16 ports that I'm going to connect 1 string each to, and I'm just going to put 50 pixels on each of those ports. A fairly significant underutilization of a controller. People do like to do this, typically not with 50, but often with 100. Because it's relatively simple to manage from a power perspective, and so they'll do this way, and they'll use 16 or even 32 ports off a controller to run a tree that way. But lots of other people like to pack as many pixels onto a port as they can. These days, gone are the days where controllers typically max out at 170 or 340 pixels per port. These days, controllers are typically up around 1,000 and more pixels per port. And so people often want to run, 600 pixels or even 1,000 pixels on each port. And so you want to zigzag up and down many, many, many times and have, 1 or 2 or maybe 4 connections to your controller instead of 16. And the way you would do that is you would reduce the number of strings. So if I wanted to make this 4 strings of, 800 or something, I could do that by changing the number of strings here to 4. Now it's only showing 4 lines. So what we need to tell it is that we need to zigzag up and down. So we want to zigzag up and down, let's say 4 times. So strands per string represents the number of times each string zigzags up and down the tree. So if we change that to 4, the tree's back to looking like it did before. And then we'll want to increase the number of nodes. So this would be, say, 400 nodes. So that's now 16 strings of 100 pixels. That's how you would represent it. And again, if you go and look at, we'll do the node layout again because it's easier to read. You can see that the node layout here is 4 strings of 100 pixels. It goes all the way up to 100. Yep, there it is, 100. But it zigzags. So the first pixel's here, but the 200th pixel's here because it goes up 100, then down 100, up 100, then down 100, and then the new string starts. Now, if I made it an odd number of strings, so if I made that 3 and I made that 300, let's do our node layout again. Node layout's your friend. Again, you can see it ends at 100, but there's only 3 strands per strixel. So the 250th node is at the top of this 3rd strand, but it always assumes you're then going to start the next one at the bottom, right? Because again, that is typically how people wire things together. Now, the common one that we see people do is, and you see it a lot with chroma mesh and the like, where it's 48 by 24 from memory. And so what they'll want to do is they'll run a string of 100 pixels. So they'll go across 48, back 48, and then they'll go 4 more in, and then they'll stop, and then they'll run another string in from there. And this sort of wiring pattern is starting to get into that weird and wonderful one. And at that point, you would need to go and turn this thing into a custom model because there will be no easy way to represent that. Now, you could just model that as a single string of pixels. So you could say that was, what's 24 by 48? I'm lazy. Computer's even lazier. There it is. 24 by 48, 1152. So I could say that was 1 string of 1152 pixels and 24 strands per string. And that would be a chroma mesh. The challenge with that is obviously it's representing it as one string, which is not a problem from a modeling perspective. This is all fine. It will sequence fine and everything else. But one of the things that these days people like to be able to do is to push the configuration of their props to their controllers. A major source of frustration for people September, October, and November is getting the lights to look on their lights like they look in xLights. And the biggest challenge with doing that is lining all of your configurations up between xLights, between your show player, which is often FPP, and your controllers themselves. All of those things need to be configured in a way that is aligned, and you need to keep them in line throughout the season while you're changing things and setting things up, etc. And that becomes a massive pain in the rear end. And one of the ways in which xLights has tried to solve that for you is to make it easier for you to describe the way in which it's all connected to your controller in xLights, and then push the configuration to one of the supported controllers. And we support a large number of controllers. Now, in order to do that, you need to be able to represent that model in one of these generally standard ways. The only exception to that is the custom model. The custom model does give you some additional flexibility in terms of how you would represent that model in xLights so that it can be uploaded to your controller. And so if you've gone and done that sort of 100 string pixels with 4 extra pixels, and then you started a new string, etc., you will need to move it to a custom model, and you will need to then spend a bit of time in configuring that custom model so that it can be uploaded to a controller. Let's talk about the configuration for the controller, though. There is this entire section here called the controller connection. If you are not going to be pushing your configuration to the controller, you can totally ignore the controller connection section. None of these properties change the way in which anything is sequenced, right? It has absolutely no impact on building your sequence. And if you're manually configuring your controller, none of this data does anything at all. However, if you are configuring your controllers via xLights and pushing the configuration, these properties here are referenced during that process of pushing the configuration to the controller. So read these settings as the controller configuration settings rather than the xLights settings. And so this allows you to do things like associate controllers with ports and set null pixels. Null pixels are pixels that exist, but you don't want to light up, but you're using because maybe you had a couple of extra pixels at the end of that snowflake and you didn't want to cut them off, but you don't want to light them up. That's null pixels. Brightness control allows you to enforce brightness control on the controller. You can also do things like color ordering on the controller and all of that sort of stuff. These days, people don't even edit this stuff here. These days, people actually do a lot of that work here on the visualizer. And so when we come back and we start to configure our controllers, we can do a lot of that stuff there. So that is that is how you set up your layout. I strongly suggest you use check sequence on a regular basis. As I said, check sequence does a detailed analysis of your layout and will highlight any issues. It generally has 2 levels. Things are either errors or they're warnings. You can generally ignore warnings if you know why they're there. I would not ignore them if you don't understand them, but if you do understand them, there's often legitimate reasons why you would configure something that way, and we display it as a warning just to make sure that you're aware of it rather than an error which you have to go in and fix. You will get errors here. So we've got a whole bunch of errors that things aren't configured on controllers. Well, that's not a surprise. We haven't defined any controllers, so that's okay. Our custom model, our image model doesn't have an image associated with it. Well, that's because we didn't associate one. And that tree that we imported after exporting has got all sorts of issues. These would not be generally acceptable. You'd have to go and fix those up. Oh, that's interesting. There's an error in the Boscoyo chroma bulb 30 hanging mouth 5. It's referring to a node that does not exist inside the model in one of the submodels. And that's an error because it's obviously not going to do whatever you thought the person was doing when they created that particular node in that submodel. So that's all good. We will delete this model here. That's obviously a very sick model. We don't want to do that. Let's quickly talk about submodels because it did come up there. Submodels are a way in which you can take a model and break it up into elements. And as you saw, the chroma bulb has submodels associated with it. So we looked at the faces, but there's also this submodel section down here. And submodels, and you can have many, many submodels per model. So these allow you to define subsets of the pixels on that model as belonging to a particular thing. So here they've separated the left eye and the right eye. And this will allow us to sequence those things independently if we so wish to. This mouth 5 down here is referring to a node 153, which clearly does not exist. That doesn't get close. 142. 142 looks like the highest. That's why we were getting that warning. Submodels. The socket is the socket and the bulb outline, etc., is a classic example of where a submodel would be very useful. So if you wanted to color the socket in gold or silver and the bulb you wanted to then change to different colors representing a bulb that's changing colors, then having access to those submodels so that you can sequence those things independently is an incredibly powerful thing to do in the sequencer. The other reason that submodels are interesting, and there are videos you can go and watch on buffer layouts, etc., is submodels let you effectively create interesting or useful subbuffers. And so if I go here, chroma ornaments, it's one of these will do, I think. He's got ones here that have matrices on them. Matrix, there we go. The image doesn't have a matrix, but I'm going to trust the description over the image. Okay, you can see here how this chroma thing has got a kind of a matrix, but it's not laid out like a nice regular matrix here. It's a bizarre twisted shape that represents, obviously a 3D ornament. That's almost certainly got a matrix submodel associated with it. Right. It's actually got a very poor matrix associated with it. This submodel here would let you light that up. But let's go and add a submodel here. Right, let's add a better matrix. Now, if we go back to our original matrix, it's 25 to 94. So I'm going to assume where are we? That's 85. That's 79. That's 30. 94. What has he done? 30. Oh, he's counting this one. That's what he's doing. So he's gone down 19 to 24. So what we're going to do is we're going to do a vertical buffer layout. And we're going to start over here with 107 and go to 112. And then we add a row. And if you add a matrix like this, so this one here is 85, 84, so it's 85 to 79. 85 to 79 and so forth. I'm not going to spend the time that it will take to do this. But if you actually define the matrix in this way, and I've done it vertically because just the pixels were laid out that way, and define the matrix this way, this will actually let you easily sequence this and put text on it and things like that, which this matrix model won't let you easily do. So you don't want to be defining your models like this. You want to actually be more careful in terms of how you lay your buffers out here to make these things more practical and useful. All right. How are we going for time? We're on an hour and we've just done layout. All right, let's quickly do sequencer. Actually, let's do controller and then we'll jump into sequencer. Controllers, you essentially need to allocate or define your controllers. There's two ways in which you can do this. One is you can hit the discover button and it will reach out onto your network and go and see if you've got any controllers out there. I seem to have 3 of them turned on right now. It's interesting, I would have expected more, but that's okay. So yeah, you can go out and reach out and find your controllers like this. It's relatively easy to configure your controllers. If you click on the visualize, which came up on my other screen, you get this screen here. Now the visualizer is a visual representation of your controller. Now this is an F16 with, well, it's been defined with 2 expansion boards. So it's got 48 ports. And then placing your models onto those ports is literally as simple as coming over here, grabbing my toy soldier and saying, he's on port 6. And I drag him over and I drop him onto port 6. And there he is, 150 pixels on port 6. My candy canes, I can put onto port 5. My circle model, I can put onto port 7. Now, you can also chain things together. So if my chroma bulb here was actually chained onto the end of my toy soldier, I can come here and if you drag it over the shape, you can see that different halves that light up. So if I drag it onto the right-hand side, it will chain the model onto the end. And so now this port has 293 pixels because it's 150 plus 143, right? And now if you come down to something like your matrix model here, this one here is 1152 pixels. You'll notice we're starting to get errors down here. And the reason for that is that the Falcon controller will not support 1152 pixels on a single port. So let's take him off. Let's go down to our tree though. Our tree is interesting because when we drag and drop our tree on, it uses up 4 ports. And that's because we set the number of strings on the model to 4. And so the visualizer takes that string count as an indication that this should consume 4 ports. And so it spread those pixels out, 300 each onto each port. We can then take our star and put our star at the end of the last string of the tree. And so that last port's now defined with 380. And it's literally as easy as this. You can do the same thing with your law controllers or your DMX. If I want to grab my channel block, my 16 channels, and put it here, I can define put my channel block here, and there's 16 channels of AC data, for instance, on this particular prop here. And that's literally how easy it is to configure your props onto your controllers if you take the time to define things in ways which are compatible. Now, I did say that we could do weird and wonderful things with our custom models. One of the things that your custom model supports is the ability to define multiple strings. So let's say that rather than doing this all on a single string, because this is 120 nodes. So let's imagine that I decide I'm going to use 2 strings. By default, it assumes that the first string is going to start on pixel 1, and then the 61st pixel will be the second string. But a more common way to wire it would be to start the second pixel or second string at 101. So I have a full string of 100, and then I'll have a final string of 20 pixels on that prop. And then if I come back to my my visualizer and go and find my chroma ornament, you can see here how it's 2 strings. And if I drop it onto here, it's put 100 pixels onto my first port and 20 pixels onto my second port. Again, making it easy. And so this is why you may want to use custom models for some models, because it gives you a great deal of flexibility in terms of how you split your strings up, something that's not easy to do with the inbuilt models. They tend to have a fixed construct, as we've been talking about. Now, there are other ways to work around these sorts of issues. There's a concept called shadow models, which there are videos available on, which will walk you through that sort of stuff. If you really want to get into that, it can help you avoid having to go to a custom model. So you could create shadow models for your bizarrely wired tree, for instance. It's an alternate way to do things. Before I go into the sequencer, I don't think there's anything else. There's a bunch of stuff down here that you may want to play with. Some people, sometimes your nodes aren't RGB nodes. By default, xLights assumes everything's an RGB node, but let's imagine I'm using strip light around this window and they're BRG strips. Well, then you can come down here and set it to BRG strips. And xLights will reorder the colors accordingly. Beware that you only want to do this in one place. So I've done it here in xLights. Don't come up here and change the color order up here to BRG as well, because that will effectively reverse it. Both this will apply it on the controller. This down here applies it in xLights. You want to do it in one place, not in 2 places. It doesn't matter which one you choose. One gets done, well, it does actually. One gets done in xLights and rendered into your FSCQ file, which is then loaded onto your show player and played. This one here gets done by your controller as it reads the data or receives the data over the network. It will shuffle the data order of the pixels before it sends it out to the wire. One of the reasons why I would generally do color order in xLights, because it doesn't generally change. Once I've built my prop, it's built with BRG pixels. It's not changing. If I go and rebuild my prop, I'm going to do it once per year. It's no big deal to come into xLights and change it. Brightness, however, is something that I would typically set on the controller. And the reason for that is brightness is one of those things you'll want to play with, maybe just during your setup time, when you're trying to sort of perfect everything and get rid of the glitching that occurs. Go and watch my other video on why glitching occurs on pixels. But you want to play with the brightness. And so putting the brightness settings onto the controller is really useful and flexible, because if you do your brightness settings, which you can do here, this dimming curve option here allows you to set the brightness of your model. The problem with that is if you then want to go and change the brightness on your model, you've got to go back and re-render and reload all of your sequences out onto your controllers or your show players and things like that. And it's a nightmare. You don't want to be doing that. So setting your brightness on your controller makes a lot more sense. Appearance settings, you can hide a model. So if you've got a model that you're planning to build, but you haven't really got around to yet, and so you just want to make it disappear, you can click this active thing here and it will disappear off the layout. It stays in your list up here, so it's still here. You can still sequence on it and everything else, but it won't appear in your layout at all. So you can do that. The other thing people like to play with sometimes is your pixel size. And so sometimes people will decide that this default of 2 is not big enough. They'll want big ass pixels. And that's just how it looks on the display. It's obviously got nothing to do with how it displays on the lights, but sometimes you may want to do that. Be very wary of playing with pixel style. Smooth's okay. I think square's okay. You may want to use square if you've got a matrix and you're using it in 3D. Matrices in 3D don't always look spectacular. They can often look the pixels can disappear, and changing them to the square setting can sometimes make your matrices look a lot better in 3D mode. Be careful about using some of the other ones. They can have a significant impact on performance, so you may not want to do that. And size and location. The only one that's really useful here is the locked property. Once you've done your layout, coming over here and right-clicking and locking your models, you'll notice that the borders around the models are now red rather than the blue. The blue lets me click and drag things. I cannot click and drag locked models. I can still change all the other properties of the models, but I can't move them around. And that's really useful because once you start to get models on top of models, and we've all got something inside our windows, right? Selecting it can get a little bit more difficult, and then you'll click on it, you'll say, okay, I've got it selected, and then you'll click again to drag it and the selection will change and you'll suddenly find yourself moving the wrong model and things like that. So locking your models in place once you're happy with them can remove a lot of the frustration. There's also a bunch of other things on the right-click menu here for doing things like aligning models or spreading them out and resizing them and that sort of stuff. There's also some bulk edit stuff in here that lets you, change the same property across multiple models at once that you may want to explore. The one thing I didn't cover is you can actually also put an image background behind this. So I'm obviously doing everything here on a blank screen. When you click on the background itself, you get access to the actual properties of the background. And one of the things that you've got access to here is an image. And so if you go to your show folder, go to mine, go to my house. All right, I can put an image of my house there and hang my lights. Now, I always use an image of my house with lights on it. And the reason I do that is because when I'm laying my tree out here, of course, everything is now locked. I'll unlock him. I want to drag my models over and size them appropriately to scale, etc. And so having a view of my house that's got the lights on it allows me to put everything in exactly the right place, which makes it so much easier when it comes to laying your lights out correctly. So strongly suggest you do that if you can find an image of your house. Now, when you're in 2D, obviously, wherever this photo has been taken from will be the perfect place to watch your show from. So you want to go out and mark that spot because that is going to be the best place. In 3D, it doesn't matter so much. And I'd encourage you to go and watch Gil's presentation from earlier if you want to understand how to do things in 3D. I'm not going to cover that here, but there's a whole bunch of things. In 3D, you have the ability to set multiple viewpoints, which you can then use later on when you're sequencing and everything else to generate effects that appear to be orientated from different sizes and sides and things like that. Okay. So any questions on layout or controllers before we jump into sequencer? Because I do want to spend some time in the sequencer. I never spend any time there. Has anything been happening in chat? I can't see chat for some reason. God, I hate it. Everyone's quiet. Anyone there? All right.
Had a question about block for LOR. Can I use a block for a controller, then have it start at channel 80 to 96? Yeah,
absolutely, you can. So let's go back to our visualizer on this controller here because we put our channel block down here. So at the moment, this is set up to be on channel 1. But you can right-click in here and set it, and I didn't hear what, 80 did you say it was? Let's say it was.
Yeah, that was what was suggested.
Yeah, so you can come in here and set it on channel 80, and so now it's defined as channel 80, which would be unit ID, whatever it is. I can never remember. But yeah, you can customize those, and those other ones don't even need to exist. But you can still upload that configuration to the Falcon controller, and it will appropriately adjust all of the configuration. In this case, this is a Falcon controller, but you can do the same thing to a Culp or a an AlphaPix or any of those other controllers that might support hanging those sorts of controllers off them.
The only other question in chat was, what about a port that is just nothing more than a GPIO pinout on a Raspberry Pi?
So, okay, so typically what you've got there is, and we'll add it this way. If you're going to be using the visualizer method, the vendor has to be a defined thing. And in that particular case, what I would be typically doing is something like FPP and then choosing a Pi hat. A Pi hat is basically configured for 2 outputs, I think. Yep, 2 outputs, which is 2 of the GPIO pins. From memory, is it 17 and 18 or 18 and 19 or something? I think it is by default. And then you can configure your props on there. You definitely want to have auto layout models and auto size set so that in the visualizer you get all of the models over here that you can drag and drop on. But yeah, that's how I do it. I assume you're running FPP on the Pi in that case. If you're not running FPP, then you're much more in the custom world and you'll need to manually configure things. xLights will configure FPP for you. It won't configure whatever your custom firmware might be. All right, sequencer. Let's go and do a little bit of sequencing. And look, there's a number of presentations this weekend on sequencing. I've got one later on today, I think it is, on auto sequencing, where I'll go through how to take advantage of some of the audio and timing track aware type elements of the sequencer. But there are there's lots of things you can do in the sequencer. So creating a new sequence, you hit the yellow new sequence button, you choose whether it's a musical sequence or an animation. Let's create a musical sequence. Let me go to my VCS folder here. Go in here. This is a bunch of music which YouTube won't complain about, so the videos won't get flagged for copyright. You get to choose your frame rate now, 40 frames or 20 frames a second. Personally, I use 20 frames a second. I find 40 frames a second is largely unnecessary. No one in your crowd is ever going to notice. People like 40 frames a second for 2 reasons. One is when you're doing fades on elements, the fades look a little bit better at 40 frames a second. And so people will often do that. That is undone if you're running your pixels at low brightness. The 40 frames a second, to be honest, is going to be largely no benefit. And I'll explain that in my other presentation on pixel power tonight. We'll talk about fading and brightness on pixels and why that's true. The other reason people like 40 frames a second is when they're doing singing faces, it allows them to get the lights just that much closer to exactly when the words are being sung. And some people feel that the singing faces look significantly better at 40 frames a second than they do at 20 frames a second. Quite frankly, most people are just amazed that the lips are flapping, so it doesn't really matter. Your 40 frames a second sequences are basically twice as large and take twice as long to render. The other problem with 40 frames a second is you max out at roughly 680 pixels per port on your controller. So if you've bought 1,000 odd pixel per port controller, and you run it at 40 frames a second, you won't actually be able to do so above about 680. There's just not enough time to push the pixel data out. It's got nothing to do with the strengths or weaknesses of the controller. It's actually got to do with the pixels themselves. Again, in my presentation from last year, on why pixels flicker, etc., explains the timings of pixels and why that works that way. Most people at this point just choose their frame rate and do a quick start and off they go. I'd actually suggest there's a couple of things here that you should be aware of. If you've defined multiple views, and a lot of people have got a sort of preferred master view, the default all models view is essentially going to add all the models in the order in which we created them in the layout tab. That is often not the order that you want the models in the sequencer. And so people will define what are known as views, where they'll order all of their models into the perfect order that they want them to be in, and they'll save that view. If you want to create your new sequence with that view, click this drop down and choose that view from this list here before you create your sequence, and then your sequence will be created with all your models in your preferred order. Most people just blow right past that drop down. They never see it, and then they have to go and manually set it up later. There are other options in here that you should be considering. If you're creating an animation, the way in which you would set the duration of your animation, by default it's 30 seconds, but if you wanted to make it a minute or 5 minutes or 10 minutes, etc., you would do that using this particular setting here. And the rest, you can add timings here, but there's other ways to add timings later, and we're not going to go into data layers. No one uses those anymore. So let's create our sequence. So here what it's done is it's brought all of my models in the order roughly that I created them, although it's not the order I created them. I don't know what order it is, it's random. Right click here and go edit display elements. And this gives you control over how those models are represented. And in fact, it happens in real time. So as we move things around here, so if I grab my matrix and move it to the top of the list here, the matrix is now being moved. Well, I can move it to the top. The matrix has now been moved up to the top of the list. So you can reorder everything in here however you like. If you want to sort it alphabetically, there are simple ways to do that here. Very easy. Now, one of the things that I didn't do in the layout, if I go back to the layout, I didn't create any groups. One of the things you can do is you can actually put models into groups. And so I can do something like create an all group here. So if I select them all and right click and go create group, I can say my whole house group. And so it will create a group up here, but, I can also, I can create a group here. I'm holding the control key down and clicking the models. I can create another group here, which is my, I don't know, let's call this my custom group. No, let's call it my square group. And things like that. So you can have groups down here, and you've got a lot of controls down here. Again, go and check out my January New Starters seminar. We go through groups in detail at that point. But we can also sequence on those groups, but notice how the groups haven't appeared in my sequence here. And the reason is when you add something in here, if I go and add, I don't know, let's add another star in here. Let's call it something distinctive. Let's call him Fred. If I come back to my sequencer, Fred's not here. None of those models are here, and that's intentional. If you want to bring them in, you need to go back to the edit display elements, and here they are over here on the left-hand side, and we can just bring them across to here. We can go and sort everything. I would typically do by name, groups, top by size. And so that's put our groups up here, and my Fred, here he is, here's Fred here. So all of those models are now available for me to sequence. So that's how you bring those in. All right, let's do a quick run around on this screen. Now, this is the default layout. You can tear these things out, put them on other screens. The only thing you can't move around is the sequencing grid. This thing is fixed in place, but all of these other things can be moved off onto other screens. Most people like to move their house preview onto another monitor so they can watch their show in large scale. There are also other views which are available which aren't even shown here. And if you go up to the view menu to Windows, there's a whole bunch of additional views here. There's a couple that I would encourage you to potentially experiment with. Almost no one is familiar with the sequence video screen. If your audio track here happens to be a video file, so you've used a video file rather than a music file, then as you're sequencing or playing the sequence, the video will actually play in the sequence video window. So you can line things up. So I don't know, maybe you use that video on a matrix or a projector or something, but you want to know what's on the video at the time when you're sequencing, then having the sequence video window up will show that to you. Another couple that people don't always appreciate is the color dropper and the value curve dropper window. And so these give you access to, or faster access to, all of the colors and the value curves, and we'll cover value curve shortly, and allow you to do things like quickly change colors. So if I drop an on effect onto my matrix here, turn it white, and I want to turn it orange, well, there's no orange available here. Now I can come into here and click on this and choose orange and so forth. Or I can just come over to here, grab orange, drag it over and drop it onto there. And now that color is orange. And so I have very quick access to all the colors that are available in my sequence, including in the drop-down list, etc. All of those colors are easily available here for quick dragging and dropping onto these various panels. And the same is true with these value curves. I can drag and drop these value curves down and place them onto individual models without having to go backwards and forwards to the various sub-panels to set things up. So these are definitely worth adding to your repertoire if you don't have them there. Okay, across the top is obviously all of the effects. There's like 50 of them, I think. They're finding good information. A lot of them are pretty straightforward and obvious. Some of them are actually very complex. Some of them are very hard to use. I know some people have made videos on the individual effects. I made some on them about 4 or 5 years ago. They're mostly still okay. There's definitely gaps in some of the effects which have changed substantially over time. The best way to try out effects is to try them out on a matrix model. Even if you don't have a matrix in your display, go and create yourself a new show folder, change to it, and sequence some things on a matrix just so you get a feeling for what each effect is doing. Because behind the scenes, xLights views every model, regardless of what the actual shape of the model is, as a matrix. And so the effect is being applied to that matrix, and then the mapping behind the scenes then puts it onto the pixels on the prop. And so if you take something like a single line effect, right, which is just drawing a vertical bar of pixels across the thing, and then you were to go and put that onto our chroma bulb, you can see that it's just treating the chroma bulb like a matrix. It's just drawing a vertical bar of pixels across the prop. And this is true across all of xLights. Everything in the sequencer works this way. Now you can have funky buffers, and there are controls over here with these render styles where I could change this particular thing to a single line render style, and now it's behaving entirely differently. Right? But the default, everything acts like a matrix. And so you want to be able to go in and look at each one of these effects to see what each one of these effects is actually doing. And some of them aren't necessarily obvious when you start to put them onto props other than matrices to see what they actually look like. Some props are quite complex. and don't operate interestingly on their own. So if I take something like the kaleidoscope effect here and drop it down, it doesn't matter what I do here, nothing's happening. It's all very boring and black. But if I was to take that kaleidoscope and move it on top of my other effect, right, now things are starting to happen, right? It's actually duplicating and fragmenting that effect. And that's because this effect picks up the effect underneath it and modifies it. And there are a few effects that do that sort of thing. You know, something like the warp effect is likewise, does absolutely nothing on its own. But when you put it here, you can have it mirror things or have it swirl things around. Doesn't look that good. The butterfly under there. Right. You can see how that doesn't look like a butterfly anymore. It's all swirled around and now it's unswirling. So each of the effects, it's definitely worthwhile exploring each of the effects just by dropping each effect on the matrix and playing with the options and see what they do. Now, let's go and choose something simple like a pinwheel. Pinwheel, yeah, I'll go through a couple of the options here, but I want to explore what value curves do on these things. So one thing you can do is each property just changes things. So the number of arms changes the number of arms that are displayed on the pinwheel. You change the thickness, and you can make the wheels. Let's add an extra color. You can make the wheels thicker or thinner. You can twist them around, so you can create spirals, things like that. The other thing you can do within xLights, however, is you can also change things over time. So if I want to start out really thin, but by the end of the effect, I want it to be really thick, you can do that using a value curve. And rather than just dragging and dropping one down, let's click on the arrow here, and it takes you into the value curve dialog. Now, by default, it's flat and it's at 0, but we can change it to a ramp. So this is a ramp up. It starts at 0 and it goes up. It doesn't have to start at 0. We can change it. And so the x-axis here is time, and the y-axis here is the value that that particular attribute is going to take over time. So what this is saying is at the beginning of the effect, it will take a value of 20, and then it will progressively increase that value until the end of the effect, where it will be at the value of 83. And so now the effect, it starts at a sort of a moderate size, and then as the effect proceeds, it gets thicker and thicker and thicker and thicker over time. So that's the power of value curves. Now, there's actually also a thing called a color curve, and you can see them here in the color palette here. We've got colors that aren't just solid colors. And so what happens if I change the colors to one of those things? Well, in this case, this particular arm here, you can see that it started one color, but over time the color is changing. And what the color is changing is it's following this progression of colors from red through yellow to green and to finally to blue. And it's doing that over time as a color curve. And if you look underneath the color, you can see that there is this clock here, which tells you that that color curve is being applied over time. But you can actually click on the clock. And now what we've done is it says it's a diagonal little arrow in. I'm sure the screen is tiny. But what it's done is it's applied that color radially in. And if I get rid of the twist and I make it thick, oops, get rid of it. Oh, yeah, sorry. I set it to negative. I set the twist to 0. You can see that it's actually applied that color palette radially in from the outside out. And if I keep clicking, I can flip it to the other way. Now it's radially around and backwards again, and then back to time. And you can do the same thing with something like this on effect down here. you could do the same thing. You can apply, by default, the color curve is a time-based color curve. So this is actually acting more like a color wash. And if I click again, I can apply the color spatially across the on effect as well. So effects don't have to be just solid colors. Effects, colors can actually change over time or in space. Now, the spatial application of colors is limited to certain effects. So a spiral effect, you can do it to. The on effect, you can do it to. But the butterfly effect, you can't. If we drag a butterfly effect onto our matrix here, right, you'll notice that the clock is locked there. You can't click and change it. And so the color can absolutely apply over time. This is on rainbow mode. I have to put it on palette mode. But yeah, the color can apply over time, and it's applying very quickly because the effect's so short. But you can't change it to be spatially because that just doesn't make any sense on butterfly. Now, to edit color curves, editing color curves is literally as simple as right-clicking, and it provides you with, again, a time-based view of the color. So the x-axis here is time. I can add another color stop just by clicking, and you can see that it's added a color stop, which I can move around. I can change the color of that color by, I think, double-clicking on it. Yep. If I double click on the color, I can change the color of that color stop. I can add in as many of these, well, I say as many, I can add in lots if I want to. They also don't have to be blends like this. If you just want it to be a hard color change, you can do that as well using these color curves. And so you get a hard color change. And if we use that particular color, you can see, oh, let's add a second. You can see that, you know, it's pink and then it's suddenly blue and then it's suddenly cyan. So that's how that color curve gets applied. Now, when I added that color, that was a new color that I've added. You can see that it's also been added here onto my color dropper, so I can access it even when I go to another palette. So that's color curves and value curves. I'm going to clean up some space here. The color panel also provides you with a number of other controls here. The hue, saturation, and value adjustments here, people don't touch these very often, but these can be really useful when you want to change something that maybe doesn't offer a great deal of options for change. So if you take something like the candle effect, where's our matrix gone? Stuff, we'll just put it on the whole house. Maybe we won't. There's our matrix. Here's our matrix. One of the challenges with the candle effect is you actually have no control over the color. It doesn't matter what colors I select. The candle is just the candle. It's always just red and orange. And if you want to change its color to be something else, you can't do it. And the way you can do that is to play with the hue settings. And so I can turn the candle into a green or a yellow or a red, pink. Anything's possible by shifting the hue adjustment, if that's what I want to do. This is also where you can play with brightness. You can attach brightness curves to fade things in, fade things up and down over the course of the effect. There's also in and out transitions where most fading is done when you want to fade an effect in or out. But if you want to do more advanced brightness control, you can do it here as well. Be wary, it's got a weird ass scale here where it goes from 0 to 400 instead of 0 to 100. And so that allows you to pump the brightness up beyond the maximum of the effect. It just has a tendency to saturate things, but you know, you can do that. This is where you also get your sparkles. You can never have too many sparkles in your show. So if you just want random highlights on any effect, every effect supports this. So it doesn't matter. Put the butterfly effect down, turn on the sparkles. They're always there. Yeah. Have a piano. Let's have sparkles. Every effect supports sparkles. And you can change the count as well. So you can make more or less of them and so forth. And you can even change the color of them these days. And if I had my color dropper, I could use my color dropper to drop the color. Chroma key allows you to do things like green screen editing, etc. So that's your color panel. Your layer blending panel, the most commonly used elements on this is the ins and the out transitions. So if I want this piano to appear over, take a second to appear at the beginning of the effect and then to fade away a second before the end of the effect, I can do that by putting in and out transitions and putting the time in. And when it gets to the end, it will fade away and then it will fade back in because it will loop back around. So there, blue, and then it will fade like that, and it fades back in. So that's how you can use in and out transitions. And there's lots of other transitions that you can do. There's a whole bunch that have been added even this year. So, you know, if you want it to dissolve in, you can have it dissolve in and so forth. And a lot of the transitions can be matched up. So you can have one transition out while the other one transitions in, and they will line up. So you can do things like wipes, where you wipe from one effect to another effect and things like that. That's all possible. Again, there's videos around on that sort of stuff. So that's transitions. The other thing that's commonly used on this panel here is the blend style. And so this lets you do things like, you know, let's say I've got a butterfly here, but I want the butterfly colors, but I don't want just a block of butterfly. I want to use a pinwheel. All right. So let's make the pinwheel a little bit thicker here. But what I want is I want the butterfly to appear only where the pinwheel is. And so you can use some of these blend styles here. There is a long list. If you click the question mark button, it will actually open up a little text document for you here, which, you know, gives you quick access to all of the descriptions if you can't read them quickly enough, because the tooltip, although the tooltip appears, it doesn't last very long, and you've typically about 3 items down before you've the tooltip disappears, and then you're opening it up again, and then you're spending a few seconds finding your way. So that can help. So if we go and make one a true unmask, you can see that now the pinwheel, all those colors on the pinwheel are gone, but it's now revealing the butterfly, and anything underneath it is being hidden. And so this is the sort of things that you can do with layering and the like. And you can get really advanced here. And, you know, if you start downloading sequences from the Google Drive, or you start purchasing sequences from various vendors, etc., you will find that particularly when it gets to matrices and trees and other high density props, it's very common to have large numbers of layers as they combine multiple effects together to achieve a desired outcome. Even something as simple as, you know, throwing a spiral down, throwing a second spiral down, right? Changing the spiral wraps to -2 so it goes the other way, and then making it a true unmask or a unmask. No, don't do that. One is a mask. You know, you can get some interesting effects where you start to combine effects together. You get diamonds and the like, and all sorts of things. So playing with layers and blend styles, and again, lots of videos out there on how to use the various layers and blend things together to get interesting effects. Other things while we're here, the layer settings panel. The layer settings panel offers this thing here, which allows you to constrain things. So if I want that to only occupy part of the screen, I can do that. It doesn't have to occupy the whole thing. If you right click, there are a bunch of resets. So left half, you know, bottom right hand corner, etc. There are a whole bunch of options like that. You can also oversize it. So if you oversize it, there are times when having an oversized buffer can be quite useful. And if you double click, it resets back to its default. Click and drag. You can also hold things like, if you hold the control key down, I think yeah, it'll limit the axis movement to just the x-axis. So there's a whole bunch of things like that. You can also do things here like blur. Be really careful with blur. It slows things down. You get a high levels of blur, and it can really slow things down. The other thing that you have here is you have roto zoom. So roto zoom lets you do things like spin things around. Also lets you do things like explode them and collapse them. Now, spinning around a spinning pinwheel is not a particularly interesting thing to do. So let's grab something like circles. And so we can this is probably not the best effect to do either. Let's do this one. Right, so you can see how this is rotating around the butterfly effect. Now, the challenge with this is it obviously it's not filling the whole space in, and this is where going back to the buffer and oversizing the buffer becomes really useful, because when you oversize the buffer, the rotation now makes the buffer so large that when it rotates, it still shows data everywhere on the matrix. So that's one of the areas where having an oversized buffer makes a lot of sense. So that's roto zoom. The other thing this gives access to is the render styles, and the render styles gives you entirely different looking effects. So if I was to make this a single line, let's turn the roto zoom off. You can see that this butterfly looks nothing like a butterfly. And that's because it's changed the shape of the render buffer. Instead of being a matrix, which is 24 high by 48 wide, it's turned it into a matrix, which is 1 high by 1152 long. And that's the result of what happens when you render a butterfly onto a matrix with that shape. Buffer shapes become much, much more interesting when you get to groups. And the reason for that is so this is the butterfly applied on the group. Let's just go to our singing elements there. So here's your butterfly applied across the entire group. Actually, let's do bars instead. Bars is going to be better. So many colors. All right, let's choose 3 ugly colors. All right, you can see how this bars effect is being applied across the whole group. So the yellow started down here, it's progressing up. It will then go through this black space. So the yellow will start to disappear here, and then it will appear at the bottom here. If I increase the speed here a little, you'll see it a little bit quicker. But yeah, it's basically moving bars up the group. But the render styles available on the group is really, really large. And so you can do things like, say, do it on per model. And so now each bars effect is being applied independently on each model. They're not actually necessarily lined up at all, but this is a way in which you can actually sequence the same effect across multiple models without having to drop the effect onto each and every model. Lots of those sorts of things. The other place that you might want to use this, and let's throw another matrix down. Let's create a new sequence. Oh, hang on, don't do that. Let's put those to, I double click. If you click a second time on these things, every time you click drag, it will drag another matrix out. So they're tri-state buttons. Let's create a group called matrices. Let's create our sequence. How am I doing for time? 15 minutes. How much time do we need at the end? Do I have to reserve?
About 10 minutes, just to answer questions and stuff.
10 minutes. I don't answer questions. All right, so if we throw text down, let's throw down, yeah, someone wanted a hello world sequence. Here we are. If we throw down hello world onto our matrix group, nothing's happening. I can bump up the size of the font maybe. I can see some yellow there, but it's not great, right? It's definitely not what we were hoping to have. And the reason that's happening is because we threw it onto a model group, and a model group's by default effectively tries to overlay a pixel grid on top of this thing. And that's not going to produce what we want. So if we go up here, however, and change this render buffer style to be horizontally stacked, you'll find that the hello world turns out fine. And so playing with your render styles and beginning to understand buffer shapes, etc., is really useful. There's a video I made in September of 2019 at my September seminar where I went through and explained all of the buffer layouts. So absolutely, a really deep walkthrough, and understanding buffer layouts is really key if you want to do anything that's semi-advanced in sequencing. As you can see, that the sequencer things, there's so many options here. There's so many effects, and every effect has so many other things that can then modify that effect. This is why sequencing or buying sequences has become so popular, is because people find that the investment of time to make something look good, just the pure investment of just doing the sequencing itself takes days to do well on a song. And therefore, and that assumes you even understand how to sequence and how to achieve what you want to achieve. And so consequently, sequence vendors have become quite popular because people find that they just don't have the time or the patience to develop all of those skills in sequencing. That being said, if you're realistic about your goals, it's not hard to sequence something. You can knock a sequence together reasonably quickly, and there's some, the auto sequencing stuff I'll go through later today will give you ideas. You can access preset libraries, which will give you particularly things like megatree effects and the like. I often find that just buying one of the holiday sequences, animated tree sequences, and then filling the rest of the sequencing in myself is a great way to sequence. Gives you all the inspiration that you might want to need, gives me a color palette, etc. And then I'm really just filling in all of my elements in the sequencer rather than trying to come up with something from scratch, which can get quite time consuming. Now, I know that's been a whirlwind tour. I didn't even touch on timing tracks and things like that. I will touch on timing tracks in my talk on auto sequencing this afternoon because they're quite key to that. We didn't touch on singing faces. Literally, you can spend days and days and days in an xLights class learning about stuff and still not cover all the depth of xLights. Now, I did at the beginning start my scan, and I did want to bring that back because for many people, they won't have seen this. So before I take questions, this has scanned my network and found a whole bunch of Falcon controllers. It has found my Falcon Pi player. Oh no, that's my F48, sorry. It has found, it's found one of my Colts. This is running a very old set of firmware, which is why it didn't come up in the discovery, I think. It's also found my Avitec controllers. So it knows that it's a PixLight 16 Mark II. It's found my vacuum cleaner too, apparently. Maybe that's not a vacuum cleaner, I don't know. But yeah, it does a deep scan of your network and then goes and finds all of your controllers, etc. So if you're struggling with and when you have pies, networks, show networks behind pies, etc., this scanner is smart enough to be able to try and see through those sort of networks as well. So definitely a tool that I'd love people to try out, and we'd love feedback on it as well. So I know that was 2 hours. It felt like 5 minutes, and I probably didn't cover half the things people wanted me to cover. But I'm happy to take questions.
Hey, Keith, you mentioned that you've got these online seminars. Where do we find those?
You can find those on my YouTube channel. I run 2 seminars a year. Now, I run 2 seminars a year in this room, one in January and one in typically September. My channel, how do I see my channel? So I also do update videos. So the seminar is 4 videos from January. It was a huge seminar. I also do regular or semi-regular update videos where I do a walkthrough of all the changes that have appeared in xLights over a period of time. I also do occasional deep dives into, so this one here was, if you're creating back-to-back, if you've got 2 P10 panels and you're putting them back-to-back and you want them as a Tune 2 sign and you want to sequence them so both the front and the back are the same, I go through how to do that. I go through disabling rendering and remote Falcon with xSchedule, or temporarily switching show folders, right? There's a whole bunch of videos here. There's over 100 videos on this site going back a large period of time. I guess I can put that link in chat if I could ever get chat to work. Why can't I see chat? Oh, there it is. There you go. What's this? So Kevin asks, I'm new to xLights. I'm importing all my law stuff. I have 5-channel arches and I haven't been able to get them to work. Is there somewhere I can go? So there is always somewhere to go. The xLights Zoom room is a great place to go if you're facing issues. If you pop in there, almost, maybe not quite, but almost 24 hours a day, there is someone, and definitely in the evening US time, there is always people in there. And if you go in there and ask, someone will help, definitely jump in and help you do that mapping. Without seeing the specifics of it, it's kind of hard to answer that particular question. And although I have some law data here, importing it's always a challenge to demonstrate. Xscanner is in your xLights. The xLights Zoom room is on the xlights.org homepage. If you go to xlights.org, it's also in the help menu in xLights. If you go into xLights and go help, there's Zoom there, so you can access it there, or you can also access it on the xLights homepage. Xscanner, so Xscanner is inside the xLights install directory along with Xcapture and Xfade and Xschedule, so you can access the scanner utility in there. What else did I miss? Tom. Is there a way to work with colors that work well on pixels? I used RGB for look poor on the house, but neat in playback. That's an interesting question, Jeff. A lot of that often comes down to how the eye perceives the color. My pixel power session this afternoon, I'm going to talk about color in pixels, but effectively the eye tends to be more sensitive to the bottom end of the color range rather than the top end. So you know, as if you put pixels on a steady ramp, you'll notice that it's quite distinct while it goes through the very dim colors, but it reaches a point of saturation after which you find it very difficult to see that the colors are actually still changing. And that's just due to how your eye perceives the light. It gets overwhelmed effectively by the pixel light. A lot of people use either dimness, so they'll turn the dimness down and they'll find that their colors become a little bit more distinct. Some people will also use gamma, and I'll talk about gamma this afternoon and what that does. The thing about gamma is gamma doesn't linearly drop the brightness, it drops the middle brightness. So the middle has a tendency to get a lot dimmer. The high bright colors still stay very bright and the low colors still stay fairly dim, but the middle just gets dropped in brightness. And a lot of people have found that, you know, setting a gamma of around 2 or 2.2 can produce better color appearance on their pixels.
Okay, Keith, we're close there, buddy.
Am I done? Am I? All right.
Yeah. So, well, no, we're going to give you an hour break and replace you with Photoshop for Dummies. So,
Sounds like my sort of class.
yeah, Jordan's going to teach you, but no, we really appreciate it. And xLights, like Keith said, you could talk for hours. But thank you very much, Keith, and we'll see you at 5:30 for the auto sequencing class. And we also like to thank Bosco Studios for hosting this room. And you'll have a great day. Time to go to your next class or remain here for the xLights or Adobe Photoshop for Dummies. Thank you.